Hello, everyone, and welcome. We are now live. My name is Francesca Rattesi, and I work for Climate Action Network International. And on behalf of the organizing committee, which is composed of the Asian People Movement of Depth and Development, Climate Action Network International, the Women and Gender Constituency, and the Youth Constituency at the UNFCCC, I would like to welcome all of you, the distinguished experts, the panel, and all of those joining us online to our event Towards BAM, the public hearings on the Just Transition Mechanism. For the past few years, civil society has been engaging intensively on just transition at global climate conferences as a means to ensure that all aspects of climate action embrace the need for securing rights and justice for workers, indigenous people, and communities, and support all countries in their efforts to find pathways for their people's prosperity. COP30 constituted a major landmark for advancing justice, equity, and rights through just transition. A decision was taken there outlining key principles that must be taken into account when advancing just transition. And on top of that, and critical to civil society demands, it committed to develop for decision in 2026 a just transition mechanism that will make all of those principles and aspects to be materialized. Our groups outline several demands regarding the mechanism, which we have called BAM, that now stands for Belém Antalya Mechanism for Just Transition. And as we prepare for the next round of negotiations, we really wanted to hear from experts and practitioners well beyond our constituencies. We wanted to hear their thoughts on how we can make the Just Transition mechanism work. So learning from past experiences and accelerating good work that is happening on the ground. And instead of holding those conversations privately, we have decided to hold them publicly and for the benefit of a much larger audience. And this is why we are here today on the fourth day of the hearings. And in this first hearing of today, we're honored to be joined by representatives from the UN Trade and Development, from UNCTAD. We have with us Katie Swan Nelson, who works on climate and development strategies at UNCTAD. Prior to joining the UN, she held various positions in academia and civil society, including at Oxfam, ActionAid, and Boston University's Global Development Policy Centers. And Katie holds degrees from Harvard University and SOAS University of London. And we also have with us Dr. Clovis Freire, who is chief of the Extractive Commodities section in the Division on International Trade and Commodities at UNCTAD in Geneva, where he leads research and policy engagement on commodity dependence, value addition, and structural transformation in developing countries. He has over 22 years of experience in the UN, having worked on programs related to commodity dependence, least developed countries, technology and innovation for development, and disaster risk reduction. So how will the session go? We'll first hear a brief presentation by our experts, followed by an interactive exchange with representatives from civil society. And in this session, we have with us Felicitus Okoko from the Women and Gender Constituency and Elena Muller from the Youth Constituency at the UNFCCC. But yeah, first we're gonna hear from Clovis, from Katie and Clovis. So yeah, happy to hear your work and experiences, and then have a conversation to, how to make the connection to this global mechanism that we're trying to build. So yeah, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Perhaps I could start and then I pass to Katie. I will share a few slides, so let me just share them now. And please let me know if you can see them.
Yes, we can.
All right, great. So once again, thank you very much for the invitation. It's really truly a pleasure for me to be engaged in this dialogue. Let me start from the beginning with a very simple proposition, is that really energy transition is not only a technological shift, but is a structural transformation of the global economy, really similar to the past technological revolutions that we have in the past that changed production, consumption patterns, source of energy, infrastructure, and institutions. These technological revolutions in the past, we see that with them, the inequality between a core group of countries and the rest of the countries only increased. So an important question now is how to not repeat this pattern of inequality. Critical energy transition minerals, they really sit at the very core of this transition. We have lithium, cobalt, copper, nickel, rare earths. All of them are not only commodities, but they are really fundamental material for renewable energy systems, electrical mobility, energy storage, digital infrastructure. And we see that many developing countries hold large reserves of these critical energy transition minerals. If I few example, Democratic Republic of Congo, 48% of the cobalt reserves, 70% of cobalt imports in the world come from there. Chile with 36% of lithium reserves. Indonesia, half of nickel production. So just a few examples to illustrate how developing countries are deeply engaged on that. And with the increase of demand that is expected is not to be much higher than the supply. Of course, there is an opportunity for developing countries to benefit for the energy transition as suppliers of critical minerals, but how to do that without reproducing an old destructive pattern. As you know, commodity dependence remains a critical issue for developing countries. Today, 95 developing countries are still commodity dependent, so they rely over 60% of the exports on primary products like agriculture, energy, or minerals, really raw material. Commodity dependence brings a lot of vulnerabilities to volatility of commodity price, to the shocks on demands of commodities. There's a challenge also for the broad structural transformation. So how can developing countries participate in the energy transition without creating a new form of green commodity dependence? So in how to enable a more just form of structural transformation. So I believe that these are at the heart of the debate on just transition. Now, what we see from the ground. So over the past year, UNCTAD, we are implementing rapid assessments on value addition diversification, and I'm bringing some examples here from Namibia, Zambia, Madagascar. And we have worked very closely with governments, private sector actors, civil society, universities, development partners. And what we have seen is that across countries, we observe a high export concentration in unprocessed minerals. Here, example from Zambia. Still relying very much on these minerals. Very limited midstream productive processing capacity. Here I'm showing a value chain of critical minerals from mining to beneficiation, and then beneficiation should be like the midstream, but then if you go downstream, almost inexistence downstream capacity. Battery material, battery packs, and so on, but you can go through other value chains, solar, wind, from minerals to those. We also see very limited backward linkers, where the economy can produce like the machinery for the mines, the generator for the mines, or uniforms for the miners, headgears, any kind of services related to that. Very limited that as well. And for sure, very weak integration into other manufacturing value chains, limited these lateral linkers. So in short, without really a deliberate policy direction, the transition, it really risks reinforcing this commodity dependence. So, and this is not a technical problem, it's really a justice problem. So more fundamentally, I think that a fundamental barrier is this lack of direction of transformation. So before we talk about trade, finance, I really suggest that we recognize the deep challenges that transformation requires. The transition, the energy transition and just transition requires structural transformation. And the structural transformation requires strategic choice, right, from where we should go. Many mineral-rich countries, they face this dilemma, basically face this question: which sectors should we prioritize? How to move beyond extraction? Which capacity should we build? So this is the kind of answers that we are bringing with these rapid assessments. And here I'm showing you one slide just to show that in the case of Zambia, we identify over 200 potential diversification value additions products within the value chain of critical minerals and beyond the value chain of critical minerals that could be produced with 85% probability or more based on the capabilities that exist in the firms in the economy of the country today, and that have a market in the global market. And also we prioritize these products based on social benefits, such as number of jobs or which sectors have higher share of women working, or environmental impact, such as which products and diversifications have lower use of energy and water, or lower impact on carbon emissions and pollution, and so on. So I would say that with the direction, we can really facilitate tackling the specific structural problems. So the diversification, value addition, it has some constraints, and these are very product specific. Here I'm showing an example for Zambia, where we have like a traffic light with different sectors and different policy areas, and the red is the main problems there. So it's without any clear long-term industrial vision, really, you could have capital and financial capital, but it may flow to upstream and extraction. You may have trade reforms, but they only benefit raw export of minerals. You could have skill programs, but remain confined on upstream mining. So you could have governance reforms, but would focus on only compliance rather than really on development. So in other words, we really have to have this strategic direction. And if I move from this strategic issue for more structural gaps, definitely gaps that are very common are financial barriers, broad industrial development and structural change. It requires patient, concessional capital aligned with national transformation strategies. And this we see that lacks very much. We need trade and market that are aligned. So global processing markets are very much concentrated. We have tariff escalation, where processed and downstream products, they face much higher tariffs than raw materials. So we have to tackle those barriers as well. Of course, capability barriers in terms of skills, but also standards, technology, and governance and coordination barriers that we do have a lot of global initiatives in standards, traceability, responsible sourcing, this and that, but the governance also must support this industrial strategy, structural transformation, regional value chains, technological upgrading, and this is really lacking. And just to conclude, not too fast, let's see here. So one way to address that from the UN side, these structural challenges, they will really precisely one of the things that the reasons that the United Nations Secretary General established the panel critical energy transition minerals. The panel emphasized that the energy transition must be equitable, transparent, development oriented. It really underscored and highlighted value addition, benefit sharing, diversification, not as a marginal concern, but as central to the question of justice transition. Building on that, now the UN system has established a task force on critical energy transition minerals to strengthen the policy coherence across climate, trade, development, and environment domains. And through these activities like these rapid assessments that we are doing in UNCTAD, we believe that we could operationalize these principles at country level, identifying specific opportunities, the gaps, in capabilities, and then deals with the policy instruments to make those, to tackle those gaps. But this is talk about coordination, diagnostics. This alone, of course, is not sufficient, and I truly believe that that's where a global just transition mechanism really becomes essential, and I look forward for us to further discuss on that. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much, and over to you, Katie.
Thanks, Clovis. I'm also going to share screen just to give a quick presentation. It's not allowing me to share, just checking if there's a permission that I need for that.
Let me check. Try again.
No, I can just speak from notes. It's not.
You can also send us the link, Katie, and we can share it while you speak.
Yeah, I'm not really sure. There's no, the share button is inactivated, so I don't really. Okay, I'll just quickly message the presentation to Annabella. Okay. And while that's cooking, I'll maybe give some quick introduction. Hi, everybody. Thanks very much for having me today. Great to be with you. And I'm going to be chatting a little bit from my position within the Climate and Development Strategy Unit at UNCTAD. So I work in a different section of UNCTAD from Clovis, and I suppose one thing to emphasise is that UNCTAD has climate work scattered throughout its different divisions, and what I'm going to talk about today is specifically from my unit, who focuses on the sort of interface between the work that UNCTAD does and the discussions in the UNFCCC. So particularly focusing on these questions of global economic governance, more recently on finance and just transition issues, and also trying to support mainstream of climate considerations within UNCTAD's work. UNCTAD focuses on supporting developing countries to access the benefits of a globalised economy more fairly and effectively, including examining and dealing with the potential drawbacks of greater economic integration. We are the UN's focal point for issues related to globalisation, trade, investment, finance, technology and development. And I think the first thing I would say is that the interplay of these topics, these issues, is precisely why there are significant challenges to overcome in achieving coordinated national and regional just transitions and ensuring that global achievement for common climate and sustainable development goals. And this presentation is a bit of an adaptation of one I did in Addis last September at the last dialogue, so apologies if you've seen it before. But I wanted to start by just bringing in some of the context on why we might be interested in what a mechanism can do for boosting cooperation around just transitions. And I think to begin with, it's important to look at the challenges. So first is vast inequality. It's impossible to think about cooperation without considering the very different positions of different countries, whether regarding their energy mix access, their labour market dimensions, land use, agriculture and biodiversity considerations, natural endowments, whether of fossil fuels, renewable potential, transition minerals, technology access, and their own political economies. These differences complicate cooperation and coordination towards their just transitions, as many countries have to try and deliver climate ambition at the same time as achieving that structural transformation that Clovis was discussing in his intervention. And then achieving that alongside tackling persistent social and development challenges. It's also worth mentioning that high inequality at the domestic level can also be a source of instability and generate distributional tensions, which impact on public support for international cooperation and development assistance, which brings me to the second challenge facing cooperation, which is contested multilateralism. As many on this call will know, there have been significant cuts to overseas assistance, declining trust, and multilateral institutions and processes are in question. And this signals a real challenge to ensuring sustained cooperation for just transitions. The third to highlight are new policy trends and measures, such as climate-related trade measures, which can generate negative spillover impacts that disproportionately impact developing countries relative to the size of their economies, and therefore their ability to deliver just transitions. These impacts pose considerable challenges to already vulnerable economies who depend on export income and who may not have the domestic capacities to transform their production processes with speed and scale. So as a result, vulnerable communities may bear the cost of the adjustment, even if there are other national efforts to make meaningful contributions to climate goals. Another relevant large trend that we're seeing at the moment is large-scale subsidy-driven industrial policies in developed economies, which is a great and positive signal for a more ambitious approach to emissions reduction and other just transition alignment, but it does risk widening the gap between developed and developing countries if there are no other supportive measures, since developing countries cannot match that approach, but can be disincentivized from using other industrial policy levers. In fact, UNCTAD's recent report last year on trade and energy found that developing countries are going back to traditional trade patterns, acting as net exporters of raw materials, while being unable to take part in the intermediate and final production stages of manufactured goods that could support transition, which is what Clovis was focused on in his intervention. And then lastly, these emerging geopolitical tensions that threaten to eclipse just transition priorities, whether in the form of economic or territorial conflicts, we're seeing significant resources being moved out of climate and development objectives and put towards other needs. Next slide, please. But at the same time, as these challenges exist, we know that there are also needs that require international cooperation to overcome. So I'm going to just highlight 4 today, but I think that the list could go on. The first is financing. As we all know, there's a huge financing gap not being met by climate finance or multilateral options. The second is financial instability and boom-bust cycles, which makes it extremely difficult for developing countries to be able to deliver managed and planned transitions when extraterritorial decisions can have such huge repercussions on their economic outlooks. Debt distress and fiscal constraints. UNCTAD's research shows that 3.4 billion people live in countries that spend more just on their interest payments than on their health or education budgets. And sadly, some of the international responses to these crises exacerbate the exact extractive practices which have kept countries locked in commodity dependence. For example, the example of Chad, an LDC, where their debt workout through the Common Framework incentivized them to maximise the exploitation of fossil fuel reserves rather than providing technology or fiscal and policy space that could help them leapfrog to a low emissions economy in a sustainable and just way. And then lastly, policy chill. The sort of ambitious interventionist forward and proactive transition planning that is needed is hampered by frameworks that can disincentivize the same industrial policy tools that are needed to speed up transitions. Next slide, please. Oh, and keep going, sorry, I've went through all of these. Thanks, Anna. So what would a more enabling global environment for just transition look like? I'm going to highlight 6 sort of enabling conditions that I think should be considered when thinking about the design of the mechanism. The first is the fact that we do need scaled up sources of affordable, adequate financing. The lack of adequate and suitable and affordable financial resources means that many countries cannot pursue their sort of expansionary investment-led transitions without jeopardising the stability of their exchange rate, facing balance of payment constraints, and being subject to international capital movements. So in this environment, increasing sort of grant and concessional climate finance, but also learning from one another on fiscal frameworks and domestic financing processes for just transitions could be really helpful. The second is in line with principles of common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities. I think faster emissions cuts in those countries that can would support those developing countries, and in particular LDCs, who are likely to need to increase their emissions in the coming years as they achieve climate resilient development, eradicating poverty, achieving energy access, upgrading infrastructure, and strengthening job creation and social protection systems. A third is rethinking the policy frameworks which prevent investment-led transitions. Accelerated transitions can't be accomplished without an expansionary economic strategy, as it implies a large investment effort of both public and private sectors at the global level. The fourth is proactive green technology sharing. Developing countries have vast renewable potential, but can't realise that as long as they're constrained by a lack of affordable access to green technologies, which forces them to continue using carbon-intensive technologies for much longer than is sustainable. Technology transfer affordably to developing countries through a deliberate process of removing IP barriers and sharing knowledge and capacity building could be a really helpful lever to leapfrog and avoid prolonging those higher emissions pathways. Expanded policy space, which I've already mentioned, revising and rethinking together international frameworks and policy norms which hold back transitions. And finally, some sort of cooperation mechanism that could be used to bring these different functions together. Though they may be nationally determined, as we all know, just transitions are not isolated. We live in one world, and so transitions are unavoidably interdependent. So a new cooperation or coordination mechanism can support the overcoming of these sorts of distributional challenges, navigating transition-related tensions, identifying opportunities for collaboration, peer-to-peer learning, mutual benefit. And these can be multilateral, but also regional and supranational approaches, and coalitions of the willing could also be transformative. And that more facilitative, cooperative and enabling approach is fundamental if we want to avoid a scenario of tit for tat, protectionism and sort of escalating tensions in the coming years. I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Clovis and Katie, for that. I mean, it was very rich in terms of insights, both on what are those deep and systemic barriers that countries face when they're trying to implement the transition. So, I mean, you mentioned a lot of them, but the vast inequalities, financial barriers, trade barriers, capability barriers, governance and coordination barriers, but also the wider, let's say, challenging the geopolitical context in which we are, the crisis of multilateralism, and maybe just a couple more highlights I wanted to pick before we move to the exchange and the questions from the panel is this issue of how commodity dependence remains a critical issue in developing countries, and how, without this deliberate policy direction, we risk reinforcing the same patterns. So I mean, now I wanted to thank both of you for the presentation. I'm gonna now open the floor to the panel, and maybe I'll break the ice with an initial question that you actually both started hinting about it, which is, in this context that you've mentioned, with all these barriers, what do you see that a mechanism situated within the UNFCCC can do to address those global barriers and allow us to advance on international cooperation in this context? So really, what do you imagine the mechanism can do to help us advance on some of those issues? But maybe I'll also directly see whether the rest of the panel has any questions, and then we give the floor back to you.
I'm very happy to pose a question. Thank you so much for the presentations. I have one question towards Clovis and one towards Katie. And the first one would be for Clovis, because the critical minerals have not been mentioned in the final decision text on the Just Transition Work Program at COP30. And why do you think that this pressing topic has not come to the attention of parties and has not received the attention that it deserves? We have raised it many times in the rooms and hoped to have it in there. And how can we make sure it comes to the attention of parties in the structure and content of the mechanism? And maybe that goes a bit along the lines of Francesca's question. So that's on critical minerals. And my question for Katie would be, and I'm sorry for posing the policy directed questions, but it's on the financing and addressing the gap of the financing. How can we ensure that the mechanism allows, although funding is not promised at the moment, how can it still allow a predictable and affordable finance to be directed towards a just transition?
Thanks, Elena. And I see Felicitus also has a hand up, so we'll get that question and back to you. Felicitus?
Hi, thank you, Katie and Clovis, for your presentations. I wanted to ask, we understand the strains that the UNFCCC is having at the moment financially, and currently working on mapping just transition actors across UN agencies and other stakeholders. I was curious to know, what do you think about the mechanism being hosted or co-host, like being hosted outside the UNFCCC or being co-hosted by a different UN agency together with the UNFCCC?
Thanks, Felicitus. So yes, the floor is yours. Katie or Clovis, I don't know who wants to start. Clovis, go ahead.
Okay, so maybe I can start with your question, Francesca. How could a global just transition mechanism, what could do? I believe a mechanism, it really, from what I have discussed, it should support a strategic structural transformation planning. I think it really should help countries identify the paths for structural transformation, select the paths that are more conducive, to social benefits and environmental sustainability. And I think that is important. Finance is important. So provide concessional finance for this structural transformation, grants-based financing windows, blended finance instruments, risk facilitation, all of that. Align climate with trade policies that I think is trade and industrial policies. So for us to address these structural trade asymmetries, promote a fair trade, market access to the things that are more downstream for developing countries. So that has to be considered. And I think also strength capabilities beyond mining when we are talking about critical minerals. I think we have to understand that this is not a mining issue, this is a structural transformation issue. So, and of course, the inclusive governance of this process. On the question, Elena, on your question on why that didn't came out of this, I think the issue is so relevant, it's so hot that the countries didn't want to touch there. I think it's more not the lack of relevance, but maybe the relevance became so high and involved with the geopolitics that countries are really now considering where to discuss this particular topic. So we saw similar patterns of the topic being brought to the attention, but not going all the way until the final discussions in other forums like G20 and so on. So I think it's more because of that. I will let the last question actually for maybe Katie address the others, but the last one as well. Katie, over to you.
Thanks, Clovis. No, it's a really good question, Francesca, around how the mechanism can address some of these barriers. And I think that, the first thing to say is that where else in the multilateral system do we have an integrated space to bring these different issues together and to sort of look at them in the holistic way that countries have agreed together through multiple outcomes in the UNFCCC that a just transition should be approached by. So I think that one of the unique additional things that the mechanism can do is create that space where countries talk about the structural constraints and the challenges. As Clovis was saying, the importance of structural transformation in low carbon development and industrialization pathways for developing countries is often not highlighted vis-a-vis the decarbonisation challenge that just transition is often framed around. And I think that is another enrichment that the mechanism can bring, is that we don't think about it just as a decarb challenge, but also as a development challenge and a structural transformation challenge. I think to this end, something that we put in our submission for the work programme last year was around this need to navigate and coordinate together a potential for some sort of coordination mechanism or framework. So it's nice to see this sort of being actualized in the Just Transition mechanism. And one of the things that we proposed in that submission was the idea of principles for cooperation around just transitions. Can countries agree together, higher level principles that can guide a more facilitative, engaged approach to jointly and distinctly, because they're nationally determined, but reckoning with the challenges that will come with trying to achieve just transition simultaneously, whether that's cross-border and regional issues or supranational, global spillover effect issues. So I think that having some of these difficult conversations without it escalating to a more formal mediation process within another multilateral space could also be an added benefit, that instead there's a sort of first port of call where countries can come to dialogue and engage on what that cooperation looks like. And then lastly, I suppose connected to that is more peer-to-peer learning. I know that there's a huge demand for countries to learn from one another, not just from those who are first movers, who maybe don't have economies that resemble a landlocked LDC, for example, but who nevertheless are pursuing or trying to pursue a just transition. But more peer-to-peer support and engagement and facilitation, I think would be a huge benefit, not only to highlight how common some of these structural constraints are for all countries, and therefore the motivation to overcome them, but also to actively and concretely accelerate ambition. So I think that's some of my thoughts around how we could try and use the mechanism to overcome these constraints. Because I think, to be honest, that is the litmus test of the mechanism. If it can't help overcome these constraints, then many just transitions will never get off the ground. On the financing question, I think thinking beyond, well, the first thing to say is I would love if we had an outcome that could ensure predictable and affordable finance. And I suppose I think when we consider financing in relation to the mechanism, there's different directions that can go in that can be very beneficial for countries. So, for example, countries right now who are looking at polluter pays, fiscal tools, or who are looking at how just transition is integrated into their fiscal frameworks and their sort of distributional challenges at the national level, sharing that learning and experience between countries could also be very beneficial to have a more just transition national and domestic resource mobilization strategy. On the other end of things, discussing how just transition could be more integrated into multilateral and bilateral financing could also be an opportunity for the mechanism. There are many countries who fear, if you speak in the 2.1c rooms of the UNFCCC, there are countries who fear that their transition pathways are not going to be financed because of adjustments to funding and conditionalities, which will prevent them from being able to access for their specific transition pathway. So one other thing that the mechanism can do as a space, whether that's the mechanism itself or within the dialogues and however they end up interrelating, is exploring this challenge of ensuring adequate just transition financing. The final thing is obviously there could be specific windows that are set up, but considering where we are in terms of the NCQG process and in terms of, the different milestones that need to be reached between now and the review of the NCQG, for example, I'm not so confident that the mechanism could host and also hold that. But I think it's a party-driven process, and if there is desire there is definitely a need for more financial support. Lastly, on the question of the UNFCCC, I don't think that the fiscal and financial challenges are exclusive to the UNFCCC. It's a UN-wide challenge. And so I think that the UNFCCC, as the guardians and the conveners of the process, are incredibly crucial as stakeholders, but instead maybe there could be an alternative, more efficient way of bringing together the different functions and capabilities of the UN system so that it can live up to, so the mechanism can live up to some of the objectives that have already been given to it, like enhancing technical assistance, knowledge sharing. So maybe we could see a more novel secretariat that is hosted by UNFCCC, but that pulls in the different functions and capabilities and expertise across the UN system in order to not duplicate, but to make the functioning greater than the sum of its parts. I think that might be a direction that can maximize what the UN system can offer, while recognizing that the financial constraints is a UN-wide issue at the moment.
Thanks so much to both of you. I think we have maybe time for one final question before we wrap up. And this is a question that we've also been posting in all the different hearings. So, I mean, what do you see the role that UNCTAD could play in such a mechanism? So what do you think some of the connections with the work that you do, could bring to this new just transition mechanism? I think, go
Yeah,
Clovis.
if I can very quickly go through some of those things, I think the mechanism could bring information and knowledge. So on that, for sure, we can work on that, translate just transition into concrete pathways of transformation, of structural transformation, identify these pathways, analyze the capabilities, the gaps, help the government, civil society, private sector to have this dialogue on how to find these solutions to move towards those paths that are more just. I think with that, for sure. In our work on these, in terms of critical energy transition minerals, in our work on this UN task force on critical minerals, that contributes to the just transition. So those are some elements that we can contribute. But on the broad aspects, I'll let Katie elaborate on that.
I mean, I don't really have much to add. UNCTAD's mandate is to provide research and analysis, technical assistance, and consensus building. And I feel like all three of those elements are central to the mechanism's functioning. And so as much as there is room and potential for UNCTAD's contribution, I think that there is plenty that we could do, as Clovis outlined.
Well, thank you so much for also those insights and those ideas. Looking at the time, I think we can slowly wrap up. And I mean, I know I will not do justice to do a full summary of everything that was shared, but I really wanted to thank Clovis and Katie for some of these ideas that you share about both the context in which we are in, but also how the just transition mechanism could help addressing some of those global barriers. I mean, starting from maybe creating space where countries can talk about the structural constraints and challenges that they're facing when they're trying to implement the transition strategies, but also helping countries identifying paths to structural transformation, how to explore the issue of adequate transition finance, and how the mechanism could find ways to open a space for those discussions, how to align climate with trade and industrial policies, issues and elements of inclusive governance, but also a facilitative, engaged approach to what cooperation actually looks like, and also the peer-to-peer learning, and with some good ideas on the potential modalities of the mechanism. And maybe just to conclude, as you said it very well, Katie, I mean, indeed, we are aware that ultimately the transition is nationally designed, it's not regionally or territorially decided and designed. But as you said, they're not isolated. And so, I liked when you mentioned that transition are unavoidably interdependent. And I think that's exactly why for us it's been so important to have this conversation reaching the international level, and now, exploring how the mechanism could deliver to accelerate the transition at the national level. But with that, we have reached the end of the session. I really wanted to thank both of you again, thank our panel. And in 10 minutes, basically, we'll have the next hearing starting with Amanda Cahill from the Next Economy, which means that this live will now stop and you'll be able to access the next hearing by reloading the Khan International page YouTube channel at the hour to see the new hearing going live. Thank you very much.